You know that ache that crawls under your skin and settles into the quiet places of your days? I carried that ache like a secret suitcase for years. My name is Hattie, and I was the one people nodded at in the neighborhood market as the woman who made empanadas. But behind my smile, there was a lock on the kitchen door that kept a different kind of silence. I grew up in 1994 in a row of low houses by the river in Eastwood, a place of rusting fences and loud cicadas where my mother Marta sold beans and my father Carlos worked odd construction jobs for a while. And then he left, and life tightened around us like a belt. I was 28 when the worst of it began, and I am 34 now, and I tell you this because time matters when you track how damage becomes habit, how fear becomes a second skin. I will tell the hard parts with restraint because there might be a child listening and because the truth does not need to be cruel to be honest. If you are watching from your city, tell me where you are in the comments. And if you can like and subscribe, know that every notification made me braver in the months that followed. I will also say this at the start. I will avoid graphic details. I will speak plainly about what happened and about how I found a way out, so that anyone who needs to act can recognize the signs and feel permitted to do so. My voice now trembled when I began to speak, but it is steadier than it used to be, and that is part of the story. The house where I was born had a sagging front step and a kitchen window with flaking paint. The smell of fried plantain and bleach lived permanently in the air. My mother Marta cleaned houses in the mornings and ran the tiny stall in the afternoon, selling beans, rice, and a few pastries. For years, she balanced her apron and her dignity, and she told me to study because schooling was a ladder out of the street. My earliest memory is of my grandmother Pilar humming as she swept the courtyard with an old straw broom that hit the pattern of the concrete like a soft drum. There was a radio that always played boleros, and the light in our living room was thin and yellow, and I liked that light because it made the dust look like stars. I was not a child who believed in heroics. I was careful and quiet. I liked books that smelled like glue, and the math teacher, Mr. Bennett, who always stayed after to help students who were slow to understand. When I was 14, I thought the worst thing that could happen would be that I would not graduate, that I would be stuck making empanadas for the rest of my life. My mother could never have imagined that the worst would come from someone who promised protection. My first real job was at a small bakery near the bus depot. There I met Louise, a man 2 decades older, who learned my schedule and praised my focus. He was polite in public, with a laugh that made coworkers relax, and a careful way of asking for favors that looked like help. He spoke often about responsibility, about shielding others, and about the importance of family. I trusted him because he used the language of protection, and because when he carried trays, he lifted them as if he were carrying glass. He taught me to balance money in my head, and he once helped me fix my rent payment when an electric bill ballooned. I remember thinking then that he was the kind of man who could be counted on. It was months later when he began to tighten his tone and to watch the way I walked. He would show up at the bakery without calling and stand at the corner like a shadow until I finished. He would tell me it was only because he cared, because the world could be cruel. I told myself it was flattering. That was how control arrived, soft, shaped as concern. The first time he hit me, I remember 3 things: the clink of a spoon on a saucer, the smell of coffee, and the way the mug trembled after he pushed me into the sink. I had never expected violence from someone who said he would protect me. He said I had been careless with money and that he had embarrassed him. He cut the light with his hand across my face. I could taste the coffee and metal, and the room tilted. Then the ache began, deeper than a bruise. I asked him why, and he said that a protector could not be disrespected by those he loved. I asked him to stop, and he promised he would never do it again. Then he packed my lunch the next morning as if nothing had happened. That lie became the pattern. There were nights when he would lock the door from the outside, and the clatter of his keys scraping the wood felt like a countdown. He forbade me to see friends, and said it was because outsiders could complicate things. He told stories to others about my fragility and my gratitude, and so I felt ridiculous to complain. When I tried to speak to my mother, she would hush me with a look that said family matters are not aired on the street. And that is when betrayal first took a deep root, because the person who should have acted like a bridge chose to be a wall. I will tell one scene in particular because it marks everything that came after. It was a Wednesday, and the sky had the smell of rain and stale diesel. My sister Elena had left a note slipped under the door asking me to come out and talk. She hammered softly on the back gate, and I could hear the faint scrape of her sandals on the concrete. The house smelled of frying oil and lemon, and the radio played a song I used to dance to with my cousins. When I opened the back window, Luis was there, and his face was calm, as if he had not been the source of the noise. He said in a low voice, "I do not want trouble." And then he grabbed my wrist, and there was a quick exchange between us that felt like glass grinding together. I said, "Let go," and he said, "You do not understand that I am protecting you." I said, "Why do you have to protect me by making me disappear?" And he said, "Because people will take advantage of you if you are naive." And then he twisted my fingers, and I felt something give inside my chest. I remember the metallic smell and the sound of the dish on the sink falling and shattering into small white moons. That night, my mother came and sat on the stairs, and she touched my knee without looking at him. She said in a small voice, "You know he loves you." And I froze, because the woman who wiped my tears in childhood was choosing a word that folded around me like a noose. Later, when I confronted my mother, she simply said, "We survive in our own ways," and walked away. The betrayal of my mother was a cold knife, because I had always believed she would be my harbor. Not long after that, a neighbor, Rosa, who ran the stationery shop, called me aside. She said, "I have seen bruises, Anna, and I worry about you." I wanted to say thank you, but my mouth closed because saying thank you would make the problem real, and because admitting it might pull my mother in two directions, and she could not be split. I started lying to neighbors to spare them from choosing sides. The secrecy was heavy, and it made me small. The pattern worsened. I stopped going out for water at midday to avoid his sudden presence. He checked my phone and read messages with a careful brutality. He told me I owed him my body and that the outside world was full of wolves. He whipped the curtain aside sometimes at dawn, like a man checking on livestock. Then one evening he was drunken and he tore down a photograph of my graduation, and he said, "You will not be anything without me." And he shoved me so hard, my knee met the corner of the sink, and I sat on the floor smelling the plaster and the hard smell of boiled rice, and I thought, perhaps he was right, because pain was easier than hope. There were moments when his voice turned soft and conspiratorial, and I wanted to believe that tenderness was proof of love, but the tenderness was always followed by an inventory of my mistakes, and then by a punishment that looked like correction. I learned to keep a small change of clothes and a plastic bag of documents hidden in the false bottom of a wooden box. I learned the exact click of the front lock by the pattern of his keys. I learned to make soup that tasted bland because blandness meant no reaction. It was not until a teacher at the adult education center named Emma started to ask me about missing classes that the outside world poked at the shell I had built around me. Emma had an open face and eyes that did not look away. She asked simple questions and did not hurry answers. And one day she took my hand and said, "I do not want to pry, but are you safe at home?" I wanted to lie as I had lied to everyone else, but the question landed like a small stone and made a ripple. When I finally told her the story in pieces, she believed each piece and did not stitch them together into judgment. She said, "We will find a way." When a neighbor named Carlos overheard and offered to pick me up on the pretext of helping me move supplies from the bakery to a stall, I felt both frightened and relieved. A plan began to form slowly, like light through curtains. He suggested we document bruises and gather evidence, and he brought his cousin Miguel, who was a paralegal and who said, "I can get you a lawyer if you want." I felt ridiculous that everyday objects could be evidence, but Miguel taught me that a photograph of a bruise, a dated message, a note from a neighbor, or threads that, when woven, could make a case. I started to keep a small notebook and to write the times the door locked, the times I could not breathe, and the times I felt seen. The checklist of survival became an archive of assault and of tiny resistances. At this point, there is something I must tell you about the man who hurt me, because people need to recognize tactics. He was not monstrous all the time. He cultivated a polite reputation. He volunteered at the church on Sundays, and he made donations that made him look generous. He used words like duty and protection, and he cultivated friends who vouched for his patience and his care. He was jealous of my autonomy, and he felt threatened by the idea that I could leave him. He had a history of being controlled as a child, and he mistook fear in others for love. He would tell me stories about his mother and about being abandoned, and he cried small tears at movies to win sympathy. He was someone who had learned that power could be masked as virtue. He kept receipts of his kindness to show later as proof. He would say, "See how much I gave you?" as if gifts could buy silence. I learned to watch his hands when he spoke, because hands tell the rest of the story. He would touch the back of his neck in a particular way that meant a storm was coming, and he would clean his hands slowly after a difficult conversation to show that he had composed himself. The backstory of my abuser is important because it is easy to turn people into caricatures when actually they are complicated, violent, and human, and we must name that complication so we can stop excusing behavior. I will not excuse him, but knowing his origin helped me to see the pattern and to prepare for it. The first real turning point came the night I found evidence of a different kind, a small digital voice recorder that he had used to record arguments for reasons he said were to protect himself. I found it tucked beneath a cushion, and when I pressed play, I heard the slow escalation of threats and the way he spoke about me to himself. It was crude, and it was a confession, and it was proof. In the recording, he said, "I make her obey," and that he had told his friends certain half-truths to keep them on his side. The sound was thin, and the room smelled of dust and lemon cleaner when I listened to it in the dark. I felt a chill that was not fear, but a new clarity. It was at that exact point that I knew I needed help beyond whispered plans in small notebooks. I told Emma, and she called a lawyer named Lila who specialized in domestic cases and who had a fierce way with papers. Lila said, "We have to document everything," and she taught me how to file a report. She also told me about a forensic exam, what it involves, and why it matters. She said when you go to the hospital, they will do a careful exam to note injuries and to collect any physical evidence. It will include photographs of injuries taken in neutral light, measurements of bruises, and swabs that follow strict chain of custody procedures. The examiner explained that all materials would be packed and sealed, and that a log would record every person who handled them. The goal, she said, was not to humiliate, but to create an official record that a judge could use. Later, when I went to the police, the detective Harris explained the legal steps with an even tone. He said, "First, we take your statement, then we schedule a medical exam, and then we log the evidence." He described how the forensic kit works with precise simplicity. He said everything is labeled, dated, and stored in secure facilities, and that the prosecutor would ask for corroboration in the form of witnesses, writings, and I remember the hospital room being white and smelling of antiseptic, and the way the fluorescent light washed everything and made the world flat. The nurse, Anna, was gentle and explained every step. She said, "We will photograph now, and then we will take notes, and then we will collect any fabrics or swabs if necessary." She told me to breathe, and she held my hand for a moment in a way that was not romantic, but human. The procedure took time, and it left me feeling exposed in a new way, but also validated because someone else had recorded what had been happening to me. The legal explanation had a rhythm and a distance that helped to contain the emotion. We filed the report with the local precinct, and the officer who took my statement wrote slowly and read back every sentence, asking, "Did I mean this exactly, and did I want to add anything?" He explained the protection order and how it could prohibit contact and require him to stay away. He also explained that protection orders can be violated and that violations require immediate reporting and a clear record. I asked him about trial, and he said it could be long, but that the record mattered for a judge. I remember feeling tiny and enormous at the same time, like a candle in a storm. That was when the community chose sides. Some neighbors whispered, and others said I should have left sooner. My mother at first denied, and then said that family things must be dealt with privately, and then she began to come to hearings and to speak in ways that confused me. She argued that Lewis had done some good things and that shame could break a person. The moment when I discovered that my mother had been told versions of the truth and had chosen to side with him because she feared being alone is a moment I still carry as a separate small wound. The betrayal was not simple. It took months to decide to bring the case to court, in part because I was terrified of being asked to relive everything, and in part because I worried about the cross-examination that would turn my words into weaknesses. The turning point came when a neighbor named Rosa told me a story about another woman who had spoken, and when Emma said loud and clear, "I will stand by you in the hearing," I began to plan the day of the rescue. I called Carlos, Miguel, Lila, and Emma, and we rehearsed how a police escort could safely remove me from the house and how witness statements would be coordinated. We arranged a code word, a small yellow cloth we would place on my balcony if I was safe, and a blue cloth if I needed immediate help. The plan was nervous and precise. On the night of the removal, I remember the sound of rain on the tin roof, and the smell of wet earth, and the slight electrical tang that comes before a storm. There was a nervous energy that made my fingers vibrate, and I held my small bag of papers like a talisman. At 9:30, there was a polite knock on the front door, and Detective Harris called to say good evening and asked to check on welfare. He had a calm voice, and the police officer at his side had a clipboard. The conversation at the door was staged, with a neighbor complaining about noise because the idea was to lower suspicion. Lewis opened the door, and his face was still gentle, as if the world had not changed. The exchange at the door expanded with lines and pauses we had rehearsed. For the scene, we had at least 10 short conversational exchanges between the officers, Lewis, and me, so there would be no single sudden movement. The officer said, "Sir, we have had reports about domestic disturbances, and we would like to speak to the person inside. Would you mind if we come in?" He said, "Not at all," and let them into the living room. I smiled and said, "Good evening, officer," and he replied, "Are you all right to speak for a minute?" And I said, "I have something to tell you." Then there were questions about dates and injuries, and I answered, "I am scared." And the officer said, "We can help," and he suggested temporarily going to the station so we can make a report. The moment where they asked Lewis to step outside, and he did so in a carefully innocent way, felt like theater and like truth at once. He cursed softly as the officers led him to the porch, but the voice was small. After that, we moved quickly. I was taken to a safe room at the station, and the officers photographed the damaged items and took statements from Carlos and Miguel and Emma and from a neighbor named Rosa who agreed to testify. The police moved with a steadiness that felt almost musical. I remember the antiseptic smell again, and the plastic chair under me, and the way rain slid down the window like tears. The raid and the rescue had a strange intimacy to it, and that night I slept in a shelter that had a thin blanket and a bedside lamp that hummed softly. There was a social worker named Sam who handed me a paper cup of tea and who said, "You did the right thing." When the case moved to court, the procedures were slow and legal, and they required patience. The prosecutor, Marta, who ran the family violence unit, explained the evidentiary steps and the way forensic reports are compiled. She told me that the medical photographs would be included in the packet, that a judge could request translations, and that witness statements needed to be consistent. She said the court would schedule a preliminary hearing and that the defense might file motions to suppress evidence or to question chain of custody. She described how a judge would consider a protection order and how criminal charges might proceed. She said the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt and that a strong, organized packet greatly helps. The legal process felt like moving through fog, but with markers along the way. The arraignment was public, and the first hearing felt like a stage. The prosecutor called witnesses and presented the package of injuries, photographs, the recording, and the statements. The defense tried to frame the recording as ambiguous and argued that my claims were exaggerated. The cross-examination was a furnace, and it forced me to revisit nights I had already buried. I breathed and I answered as clearly as I could, and Leela was a marshal at my side. She objected when the defense pushed, and she reminded the judge of precedents for witness treatment and for allowing certain evidence. The courtroom smelled of old wood and coffee, and the leather of the benches was worn smooth by other people suffering. Then the judge asked him if he had anything to say, and his voice was small and rehearsed, and he said, "I was trying to protect her and that I made mistakes." He spoke in a way that tried to turn ownership into care. The sentence at the end was not the only measure of victory, but it was important. He was convicted of repeated assault and ordered to attend anger management classes, to serve probation, and to stay away under a protection order. The judge emphasized accountability and said that protection has limits and that when protection becomes prison, it ceases to be protection. The verdict did not heal everything, but it made public what had been private, and that had consequences for my mother, my neighbors, and the local market where people now looked at me with a different softness. After the verdict, I had months of therapy with a counselor named Rosa who taught me to name emotions. She showed me exercises to reframe fear and to separate what had been done to me from who I was. Now I began to stitch things back together. I took a job teaching baking classes to teenagers at the community center, and I started a small group for survivors. I named the group New Dawn, and it met once a week in a church hall where the light was generous and children drew with crayons. The work of rebuilding included practical steps. I learned how to open a bank account in my name, I obtained a restraining order, and I enrolled in night classes to finish the diploma I had once feared I would never complete. The most surprising change was how I learned to trust incremental kindness. I reconnected with my sister Elena, who helped me to catalog receipts and to file for compensation from a small municipal fund. For victims, the municipal process required an application, a copy of the police report, and an affidavit, and took approximately 8 weeks to be reviewed, but it provided a small stipend that helped with rent. For the public side of things, we started a petition at the bakery, and a local reporter wrote a piece that named the problem and urged community resources to respond. The story resonated, and the small charity that supported survivors provided a seed grant that allowed me to open a Saturday class teaching pastry skills to women who wanted to earn their own money. The CTA I promised earlier is something I need you to hear and to answer, because community matters and your words can become someone else's lifeline. If this story touched you, I know it is heavy and I know it can stir things that are hard to hold. If any part of this resonated, Please write below the name of your city and one short line that says, "I am here" or "I see you." It does not need to be a story. Just a name and a word will do. The reason I ask this is because when people read a single word and see that they are not alone, that small act can change how they understand their own circumstances. Your comment can be read by someone who cannot name their abuser and who needs proof that the world can be a witness. I promise comments will be confidential as much as the platform allows. And if you include a way to contact local resources in your own city, that can be helpful to others. This small network of names and cities helped me feel less alone. And if you share, you also give others permission to do the same. Now, back to how things progressed. After the trial, the practical parts of recovery took on a rhythm. 1 month later, I had already moved into a 2-room apartment with a small balcony that faced a narrow alley, and I was learning the names of my new neighbors. 1 month later, I was working 3 shifts a week at a bakery and teaching a Saturday class. I was waiting in line at the social services office to sign for medical follow-up, and I felt a new modest pride in my own schedule. The first month was raw and fragile, and it included nights when I would awake from a dream of him opening the door, and I would have to breathe until the tremor softened. I was introduced to a therapist at the municipal clinic named Rosa, who specialized in trauma, and she taught me grounding techniques like feeling the soles of my feet against the floor, counting backwards from 20, and describing 5 things I could see to bring myself back to the present. The social worker Sam helped with paperwork and with referrals to legal clinics and to a vocational program that provided a micro grant to buy a small oven. 3 months later, the routines began to feel normal, and the newness of fear had softened into caution. 3 months later, I had completed a small business plan for selling empanadas to cafes, and I had a permit in my name. I had attended a few meetings for survivors and had presented our story to a small NGO that connected women to microloans. At 3 months, I learned to cook without looking over my shoulder. I had a calendar with payroll and a stack of thank you notes from students and a photocopy of the court transcript that I kept in a folder labeled Documents for Safety. I also started to volunteer 1 evening a week at the shelter where I had stayed, and I began to mentor another woman named Lucia, who had left a controlling partner and who came with her own catalog of small victories and setbacks. The 6-month mark felt different because it was not about an ending, but about a horizon. 6 months later, I had a modest stall at the Eastwood market where my empanadas sold well and where people knew my voice. I had reestablished a relationship with my mother, though it was careful and required boundaries. She came to one of my baking demonstrations and watched without comment. She later slipped me a note that said, "I am sorry and I love you," and I folded it into my wallet and kept it like a small grain of salt. The court had ordered Luis to classes and to stay away, but there were days when his presence was a rumor, and I had to call the police on a couple of occasions, and the officers responded quickly, which made me trust the system a little more. 6 months later, I had also started a community training program with Emma and Leela and with the local NGO to teach shopkeepers about signs of coercive control and how to document suspected abuse. We placed posters in the bakery and the market about local hotlines and how to preserve evidence, photographs, and messages. And when I spoke at the first training workshop, my hands shook, but the room was kind, and people asked questions about how to help a neighbor without endangering them. The legacy I wanted to build was not vengeance, but prevention and support. The epilogue of my life is not a clean slate, but a thread of work that continues. I opened a small group called New Dawn, and we met every Tuesday to bake, to file forms, and to practice how to support a neighbor without exposing them to risk. I also partnered with a legal clinic to create a packet called Survival Papers that helped people gather the documents the police would need, and that packet circulates in the market and the community center now. Recapping what I learned, the woman who used to shrink into herself became someone who could ask for help and could organize that help into a plan. I did not become unafraid, but I learned to use fear as information and not as a sentence. The concrete result is that the man who hurt me was held accountable, and that I now run a small business and a survivors group, and that I have a network that believes and acts. The lesson I would pass along is simple. If you suspect coercion, observe the signs. Do not silence your questions. Ask gently and document what you can and when you can. Seek help, do it, because time and small details matter. If you see a neighbor with unexplained injuries, ask a question and make a plan that keeps the person safe. Do not assume you know everything, and do not blame the victim. The CTA I leave is this. If you are in a situation like mine and it is safe to do so, call your local hotline, find a trusted friend or teacher, and document what you can. Photographs of injuries, dated messages, and witness notes are useful to the police and the court. If you are not in immediate danger, contact local services. And if you are in the U.S., you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline or find resources online. If you are elsewhere, your local health clinic or social services can guide you. If you are not a survivor but a witness, be the person who asks a quiet question and who records what you see. My final invitation is to join our community here on the channel. Subscribe if you want to follow our series on recovery and prevention, and if you can share this video, you might make the path out visible for someone else. I will end with this image. I once believed my life was a kitchen with its lights off and a locked door. Now, I run my own stall in the daylight, and sometimes when the sun hits the empanadas just right, I see the flake of sugar and remember that sweetness can return to mouths that have known bitterness. I survived because others believed me, because I made a plan, and because I refused to let silence be my final shelter. If my story helps one person to speak, it has done the work it needs to do. Thank you for listening, and if you can comment your city and one word that says I am here, you will be giving someone a small gift of courage.